Hey guys, tonight, the scandal of the solitary chair. In the year of our Lord, 1852, the most dangerous object in a British drawing room was not a loaded dueling pistol, nor was it a vial of unlabeled arsenic tucked away in the scullery. No, the most threatening item in the domestic arsenal was a single, unoccupied chair, placed far from the warmth of the hearth and the watchful gaze of a chaperone. To the modern mind, a solitary chair is an invitation to peace, a quiet nook to read, to scroll, or perhaps to simply exist. But to the Victorian sensibility, to be alone was to be suspicious. To be unaccompanied was to be a moral red flag, waving wildly in the winds of social ruin. The Victorians were a people obsessed with the architecture of visibility. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? A Victorian wouldn't care about the tree. They would be far more concerned with why the tree was wandering in the forest without a proper escort and a letter of introduction. In their world, privacy was not a right, it was a symptom. If you sought the company of yourself, the immediate assumption was that you were up to something remarkably wicked, or, at the very least, something dreadfully un-British. The geometry of suspicion. Consider, if you will, the layout of the 19th century parlor. Every piece of furniture was designed for a collision of witnesses. Sofas were built for two, dining tables were vast expanses of accountability, and even the fainting couch was positioned so that, should one actually faint, one would do so in the direct line of sight of at least three concerned aunts. When a young woman, let us call her Miss Arabella, decided she wanted to sit in the garden with nothing but a book of poetry and her own thoughts, she wasn't just taking some air. She was committing a radical act of social defiance. The solitary chair was the physical manifestation of this defiance. To sit alone was to suggest that your own internal world was more interesting than the rigid, suffocating, and frankly exhausting world of polite society. And society, in its infinite wisdom, could not allow that. For if people began to enjoy their own company, who would be left to judge the neighbors? If solitude became a virtue, the entire industry of gossip, the very engine of the Victorian economy, would grind to a halt. The medicalization of the me time. It wasn't just the gossips who feared the alone time, it was the men of science. Victorian doctors, with their waistcoats and their misplaced confidence, had a specific term for the desire to be alone: morbid seclusion. If a gentleman preferred his library to the hunt, or if a lady preferred her diary to the ball, they weren't called introverts. No, they were diagnosed with melancholic congestion or nervous atrophy. The medical logic was simple, if entirely insane. The human brain, much like a delicate piece of fruit, would begin to rot if not constantly exposed to the preservative of social observation. Solitude was believed to be a gateway drug to more serious ailments. First, you sat alone in a chair, next you were thinking for yourself, and before you knew it, you were an anarchist, a poet, or heaven forbid, someone who didn't care about the price of corn. For women, the stakes were even higher. The unaccompanied female was a category of person that triggered a Victorian-wide emergency. A woman alone was perceived as a vacuum, and as we know, nature abhors a vacuum. Therefore, any space not filled by a husband, a father, or a lady's maid would inevitably be filled by hysteria or the vapors. The solitary chair, therefore, wasn't just a seat, it was a petri dish for madness. The human firewall. To combat the scandal of the solitary chair, the Victorians invented the most formidable security system in history, the chaperone. This was usually a woman of advanced years, minimal humor, and a supernatural ability to sit in a room for 6 hours without blinking. Her job was simple: to ensure that solitude never happened. If a suitor came to call, the chaperone was the human firewall. She sat in the corner not as a guest, but as a monument to the fact that nothing was happening. The irony, of course, is that the more the Victorians tried to prevent the scandal of being alone, the more they obsessed over it. They created a culture where the closed door was a provocation. A shut door didn't mean I'm changing my clothes. It meant I am currently rewriting the laws of gravity and possibly talking to ghosts. A land of too much space. While the British were busy clutching their pearls over a solitary walk in Hyde Park, their American cousins were dealing with a different version of the same fear. In the vast, sprawling landscapes of the United States, being alone wasn't just a moral red flag, it was a logistical reality. Yet, even in the land of the free, the Victorian influence held sway in the cities of the East Coast. In New York or Boston, the solitary chair was viewed with just as much skepticism. The American elite, desperate to prove they were just as refined and just as repressed as the English, adopted these rules with a vengeance. However, they added a uniquely American twist: the fear that solitude would lead to originality, which was often seen as the cousin of unprofitability. The comedy of the quiet room. There is a profound humor in looking back at a society that was so terrified of a person sitting in a room by themselves. We live in an age of noise, notifications, pings, and the constant hum of the digital hive. To us, the Victorian struggle seems like a dream, but for them, the silence was loud. The silence was where the self lived, and the Victorian era was designed to keep the self firmly in its place, usually under a very heavy, very uncomfortable corset. So the next time you find yourself alone, sitting in a chair with no one to watch you, take a moment to appreciate the scandal you are causing. Somewhere, a Victorian ghost is gasping into her lace handkerchief, wondering why on earth you aren't being supervised by a stern aunt named Agatha. The chaperone's shadow. The law of the third wheel. In the modern world, being a third wheel is a social nightmare, a position of awkwardness where one feels like an uninvited ghost at a feast for two. However, in the strict corseted reality of the Victorian era, the third wheel was not an accident. It was a legal, moral, and social requirement for the very act of drawing breath in the presence of the opposite sex. To be two was a scandal in the making, but to be three was the height of civilization. The chaperone was the human embodiment of a firewall. Her job was simple yet exhausting, to ensure that solitude remained an impossible dream. In the mid-1800s, if a young man and a lady were found in a room alone, even if they were merely discussing the weather or the quality of the local mutton, it was assumed that the foundations of the British Empire were under immediate threat. The chaperone was the anchor that kept the ship of morality from drifting into the treacherous waters of privacy. The architecture of observation. For a voice generator, notice the weight of the semicolons here. They represent the rhythmic pauses of a Victorian storyteller. The Victorian home was not designed for secrets. It was a panopticon of manners. Every drawing room had a chaperone's chair, usually a high-backed, uncomfortable piece of furniture positioned strategically in a corner. From this vantage point, an elderly aunt or a hired guardian could monitor the trifecta of propriety: the distance between knees, the direction of gaze, and the frequency of sighs. There was a specific science to this. A gentleman was expected to maintain a distance of at least 2 feet from a lady at all times. If he leaned in to hear a secret, the chaperone would cough. If he reached out to turn a page of sheet music and his knuckle accidentally brushed her sleeve, the chaperone would drop her knitting. These were not mere accidents, they were acoustic alarms. The professional watchers. In the upper echelons of New York and London society, chaperoning became a professional art form. These women, often widows of impeccable lineage but dwindling bank accounts, were the ultimate social police. They possessed a Victorian stare that could lower the temperature of a room by 10 degrees. For the American audience, imagine the Gilded Age ballrooms. Amidst the gold leaf and the champagne, the wallflowers were not shy teenagers, they were the battalion of chaperones. They sat in rows, silent, vigilant, and terrifying. They were the reason why a private conversation in 1870 usually involved 2 people talking while a third person stared intensely at the back of their heads. The comedy of the third presence. The absurdity reached its peak during outdoor excursions. If a couple wished to go for a walk in the park, a daring feat of athleticism, they were followed, not by a stalker but by a companion. Picture this: a young couple walking 10 paces ahead, whispering about poetry or the latest scandal. 10 paces behind them walks the chaperone, clutching a parasol like a weapon of war. If the couple sped up, the chaperone sped up. If the couple stopped to look at a swan, the chaperone stopped to look at the couple. It was a low-speed chase that could last for hours. The voice generator should emphasize the irony here. The Victorians were so terrified of what might happen in the shadows that they ensured every person had a shadow. You were never alone with your thoughts. You were always alone with your thoughts and a woman named Martha who was judging your choice of hat. The code of the fan and the glove. Since verbal privacy was impossible, the youth of the 19th century developed a silent language, a way to bypass the chaperone's ears. This was the language of the fan. A fan placed near the heart, you have won my love. A fan closed sharply, the chaperone is looking, stop talking. A fan waved slowly, I am married to this conversation, but I wish I were dead. The chaperone, having been a young girl herself once, knew every single one of these codes. This led to a magnificent game of cat and mouse, where the mouse was trying to hold hands and the cat was trying to maintain the moral integrity of the Western world. The breaking of the shadow. The beginning of the end for the chaperone came not from a revolution of the heart, but from a revolution of the wheel. The invention of the bicycle in the 1890s was the ultimate chaperone killer. It is physically impossible to chaperone someone on a bicycle if you are a 60-year-old woman in a heavy wool dress. As young women began to wheel away into the countryside, the shadow could no longer keep up. For the first time in a century, the solitary chair was no longer in the parlor, it was a bicycle seat, moving at 15 miles per hour away from the prying eyes of Aunt Agatha. Conclusion of the shadow. To be alone in the Victorian era was a luxury that society refused to sell. They believed that human beings, when left to their own devices, would inevitably fall into ruin. The chaperone was the protector of that ruin. She was the third wheel that kept the bicycle of society from tipping over into the mud of scandal. The etiquette of the solo meal. The culinary crime of the single plate. In the modern world, dining alone is often seen as a power move or a moment of zen, a table for one with a book and a glass of wine. However, in the Victorian era, eating a meal in solitude was not a choice. It was a psychological emergency. To the 19th century mind, the act of consuming food was a communal performance. To eat without an audience was considered suspicious. To eat without a companion was considered tragic. And to eat alone in public was, quite simply, an act of social suicide. If you were a Victorian gentleman or lady found dining alone, society didn't just think you were hungry, they thought you were a ghost. You were a person who had failed the most basic test of humanity, the ability to find someone, anyone, to watch you chew. The ritual of the invisible guest. The rules for the solo meal were designed to hide the fact that you were, in fact, alone. If a gentleman were forced by circumstance to dine at his club without a companion, he was expected to follow a set of bizarre, unspoken protocols. He could not simply sit and eat. No, he had to perform the busy man's masquerade. He would surround himself with props. A newspaper was not merely for reading, it was a shield. It was held high, like a fortress wall, to signal to the room, I am not lonely. I am merely so overwhelmed by the affairs of the empire that I have no time for the triviality of friendship. The rustle of the Times was the soundtrack to his solitude. If he lowered the paper for more than 10 seconds, he risked eye contact. And in a Victorian dining room, eye contact with a stranger while your mouth was full was equivalent to a marriage proposal. The tea tray of despair. For a woman, the situation was far more precarious. A lady could never, under any circumstances, be seen dining alone in a public restaurant or hotel. To do so was to invite a red flag of the highest order. It suggested she was a woman of the world, a polite Victorian euphemism for someone who had lost her way and her virtue. If she were at home and her family was away, she did not simply make a sandwich. She was expected to endure the ritual of the formal tray. Even if she were the only living soul in the house, the butler, if they were wealthy, or the maid would set a table, as if a king were arriving. Imagine the scene for the voice generator. The silver is polished, the fine bone china is laid out, the linen napkin is starched until it could stand on its own. She sits. The room is silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock. She is dining with ghosts. She must use the correct fork for the fish, even though the only witness is a disinterested cat. Why? Because the Victorians believed that if you stopped using the fish fork just because you were alone, you were only one step away from living in a cave and howling at the moon. The art of staring at walls. The most hilarious rule of the solo meal was the fixed point of focus. Since you had no partner to look at, where did your eyes go? You could not look at other diners, that was predatory. You could not look at the floor, that was melancholic. The solution? You picked a painting on the far wall, usually a very dull landscape of a Scottish moor or a bowl of dying fruit, and you stared at it with the intensity of a scientist discovering a new planet. You ate your mutton while mentally measuring the distance between a painted cow and a painted tree. This was known as dignified distraction. It told the room that you were deep in intellectual thought, rather than wondering why your life had come to the point of eating peas in silence. The hustle and the haste. Across the Atlantic, the Americans were beginning to break these rules, but with a uniquely neurotic twist. In the bustling lunchrooms of New York City, a new phenomenon was born, the quick lunch. Here, businessmen ate alone, but they did it at such a frantic speed that society didn't have time to judge them. They stood at counters, bolting down oysters and coffee as if they were running from a fire. This was the American version of the solo rule. If you eat fast enough, the loneliness can't catch you. But even here, the Victorian ghost remained. If a woman entered these spaces alone, the room would fall silent. The clatter of forks would stop. She would be ushered to a ladies' section, a literal wooden cage of propriety, where she could eat her soup in a segregated, supervised solitude. The mental health of the mutton. Victorian doctors actually weighed in on this. There was a genuine medical belief that eating alone caused dyspepsia, indigestion caused by a lack of social stimulation. The theory was that the animal spirits required for digestion were only activated by the sound of human voices. If you ate alone, your stomach would effectively fall asleep. Therefore, solo diners were encouraged to talk to themselves, softly of course, or to read improving literature to keep the brain active so the stomach would follow suit. For the AI narrator, use a tone of mock seriousness here. Imagine a Victorian man sitting in a dark room, whispering Shakespeare to his mashed potatoes just to ensure his heart didn't stop. The legacy of the lonely fork. As the 19th century groaned toward its end, these rules began to soften. The rise of the department store tea room gave women a safe space to eat unaccompanied, a radical liberation fueled by the desire to sell more hats. But the scandal of the solitary chair at the dinner table lasted for decades. It was the final frontier of Victorian social control. They knew that a person who could enjoy a meal alone was a person who was truly free. And in the 1800s, true freedom was the most scandalous thing of all. The art of the pensive stare. The performative melancholy. In the modern world, if you see someone staring blankly into space for 10 minutes, you might check to see if they need medical attention, or perhaps a stronger Wi-Fi signal. But in the mid-Victorian era, staring into the abyss was a finely tuned social skill. It was the art of the pensive stare. The goal was simple, yet incredibly delicate. You had to look lonely enough to signal that you possessed a poetic soul, but not so lonely that people began to suspect you were a dangerous lunatic. There was a razor-thin line between being a brooding intellectual, like Lord Byron, and being someone who was about to be forcibly removed to an asylum. The geometry of the gaze. For the voice generator, pay close attention to the em-dashes. They are the breaths of the narrator. The pensive stare required a specific physical geometry. You could not simply look at a wall that was vacant. You had to look through the wall as if you were observing the very slow disintegration of the universe. The head was usually tilted at a 15-degree angle, the chin was resting lightly on a thumb, and the eyes were unfocused, yet heavy with the weight of unwritten sonnets. If you were a young man in a Victorian parlour and you found yourself momentarily unaccompanied, you could not just sit there. To sit idly was to be a social failure. Instead, you reached for the stare. You looked toward the window, not to see the carriage passing by, but to contemplate the fleeting nature of time. This signaled to everyone in the room, I am alone because my thoughts are too vast for your trivial conversation. The poetic soul versus the dangerous lunatic. The danger, of course, was the crazy eye. The Victorians were terrified of madness. It was the boogeyman in every attic. If your stare was too intense, or if you forgot to blink for more than 30 seconds, the social red flag was raised. A poetic stare was soft. It was accompanied by a slight, almost invisible sigh, a ghost breath. A lunatic stare was wide-eyed. It involved gripping the arms of your chair until your knuckles turned white. One invited a sympathetic whisper from a lady. The other invited a visit from two large men with a straitjacket. The American audience of the 19th century, particularly those in the transcendentalist circles of New England, took this to an extreme. In places like Concord or Boston, the pensive stare was practically a currency. If you couldn't look pensively at a pond for 3 hours, were you even an intellectual? But even in the land of the free, the rules of decorum applied. You had to look lonely with purpose. The Victorian TV screen. For the solo Victorian, the window was the ultimate prop. It provided a frame for their loneliness. To stand by a window and look out at the rain was the gold standard of pensive behavior. It allowed a person to be unaccompanied while still being visible to the world. It was a performance of privacy. You were saying, I am in my own world, while simultaneously making sure that Mrs. Higgins from across the street could see exactly how tragic and beautiful you looked in that specific lighting. It was the 19th century version of a candid Instagram photo, highly staged, deeply self-conscious, and entirely focused on the vibe of being a tortured soul. The props of the pensive. You could not stare with empty hands. That was for the lower classes. To truly master the art of looking lonely yet intellectual, you needed a signifier of depth. Usually this was a book, but never a new one. It had to be a leather-bound volume, preferably in a language you didn't fully understand, with a finger placed inside to keep your spot. You weren't reading it, you were reflecting on it. Alternatively, a gentleman might use a pocket watch. Looking at a pocket watch while staring pensively suggested you were contemplating the mortality of man, rather than just checking if it was finally time for dinner. For a lady, a single wilting flower was the preferred prop. Staring at a dying rose signaled a melancholy preoccupation with the seasons of life, a sure sign of a poetic soul. A lady's limitation. While a man could be brooding, a woman had to be pinning. The female version of the pensive stare was much more restricted. If a woman looked too thoughtful, doctors worried her brain would overheat. Therefore, her stare had to be directed towards something domestic, a needlepoint frame, a teacup, or the horizon where her hypothetical husband might appear. A woman staring at a bookshelf was a red flag. A woman staring at a cradle, even an empty one, was a poetic masterpiece. Society demanded that even in her loneliness, her thoughts had to remain useful. The AI narrator's note on packing. For the voice generator, the humor comes from the contrast. use a very formal, almost National Geographic tone for the descriptions of the physical movements. Imagine the narrator saying, "The chin must be elevated, the eyes must be damp, the heart must be heavy." Use the semicolons to let the AI take a pompous breath. Conclusion: the legacy of the look. Why did the Victorians go to such lengths? Because they were a society that had no delete button. Once your reputation was gone, it was gone forever. Being alone was a vacuum that society filled with its worst fears. The pensive stare was a way to control that narrative. It was a way to say, "I am not alone because I am unloved. I am alone because I am deep." By the time the 20th century arrived, the pensive stare began to fade, replaced by the active look of the modern era. We stopped wanting to look like poets and started wanting to look like we were busy. But if you go to a coffee shop today and see someone staring into their latte with a look of profound, tragic depth, congratulations. You have found a Victorian ghost, still trying to prove they aren't a dangerous lunatic. A lady's walk, the 10-yard rule. The pavement of peril. In the modern urban landscape, a woman walking down the street alone is simply a person in transit. She might be listening to a podcast, she might be checking her watch, she is, for all intents and purposes, invisible. But in the 1860s, a lady walking alone on a public sidewalk was not just a pedestrian, she was a walking social emergency. To the Victorian mind, the street was a masculine battlefield. For a woman of standing, to navigate this space without a male protector or a sturdy servant was to walk a tightrope over a canyon of scandal. The goal was to reach your destination without being mistaken for a woman of the night, a term the Victorians used to describe those who sold their company, but which society applied to almost any woman who looked too comfortable while walking by herself. The 10-yard rule of recognition. The 10-yard rule was an unwritten, yet terrifyingly precise, social law. It dictated exactly how a woman must behave the moment an acquaintance appeared in the distance. For the voice generator, note the semicolons, they are for the haughty pauses. If a lady saw a gentleman she knew approaching from 10 yards away, she was forbidden from waving. Waving was frantic. Instead, she had to wait until the distance closed to exactly 3 yards, the zone of acknowledgement. At this point, she was permitted a slight inclination of the head. Not a bow, not a smile, but a microscopic dip of the chin that suggested, "I recognize you exist, but I am far too busy being respectable to enjoy it." If she failed this test, if she smiled too broadly or, heaven forbid, stopped to chat for more than 60 seconds, the invisible red flag was hoisted. To be alone and lingering was the ultimate Victorian sin. A lady was expected to move with purposeful momentum, as if she were a steam engine in a silk dress. The architecture of the fast walk. To avoid being mistaken for a public woman, a Victorian lady had to master the propriety sprint. This was a walk that was fast enough to discourage strangers from speaking to her, but not so fast that she appeared to be running from the police. Her eyes were the most important tool in her arsenal. She could not look at the shop windows, for that was idleness. She could not look at the faces of passers-by, for that was invitation. Instead, she was required to fix her gaze approximately 4 feet in front of her own toes. She was essentially studying the sidewalk with the intensity of an archaeologist. If a man tipped his hat to her, she was to look through him, not at him. To the Victorian lady, every man on the street was a ghost until proven otherwise by a formal letter of introduction. To acknowledge a stranger's existence was to invite a moral contagion that no amount of tea and prayer could wash away. The umbrella as a defensive fortification. In this era, the parasol or umbrella was not merely a tool for weather, it was a tactical weapon. A lady alone used her umbrella as a radius of exclusion. When walking through a crowd, the umbrella was held at an angle that shielded her face from the gaze of the vulgar. It was a portable wall. For the AI narrator, imagine the dry wit here. The Victorians were so terrified of the human eye that they invented a way to carry a roof over their heads just to avoid making eye contact with a butcher. If a woman of the night was identified by her colorful clothing and her stationary position, the lady was identified by her drab colors and her refusal to stop moving. It was a survival of the fastest. If you stopped to tie your shoe, you were a scandal. If you stopped to look at a bird, you were a tragedy. The American urban panic. In New York City, particularly around the Ladies' Mile on Broadway, this rule took on a frantic capitalist energy. American women were becoming more independent, yet the Victorian rules followed them like a persistent shadow. The New York press of the 1880s was obsessed with the unescorted female. Newspaper editorials warned that a woman walking alone in the late afternoon was inviting the devil to tea. The American solution was the chaperone carriage, a way to move through the street without actually touching the street. To step onto the pavement was to enter the grisly wilds of humanity. For the voice generator, emphasize the word pavement with a hint of disgust. For the Victorian elite, the ground was where the unwashed lived. A lady's boots were never meant to actually meet the common soil of a public road unaccompanied. The dreaded lingering and the shop window. The only time a lady was permitted to stop was in front of a shop window, but even then there were rules. She had to look at the display with critical detachment. She could not look wistful. If she looked wistful, she was weak. If she looked critical, she was discerning. If a man approached her while she was looking at a display of lace, she was to immediately enter the shop. The shop was a sanctuary of commerce. Once inside, the rules of the street vanished, and the rules of the customer took over. The shopkeeper was her temporary chaperone. Conclusion: the freedom of the fast pace. Why did they endure this? Because the Victorian street was a theatre of reputation. Every step was a vote for your own morality. The 10-yard rule was the boundary of your social life. It is a profound irony that by trying so hard not to be women of the night, Victorian ladies turned the simple act of walking into a military operation. They weren't just going to the grocer, they were navigating a minefield of red flags, with nothing but a parasol and a stern expression to protect them. A bachelor's burden. The fortress of untidy despair. In the sprawling metropolis of London, and indeed in the ambitious brownstones of New York, there existed a figure of intense social fascination and profound superstition. The bachelor, to the Victorian mind, a man living without the stabilizing influence of a mother, a sister, or a wife was not merely single. He was a ship without a rudder, a loose cannon in a world of rigid social ballistics. A single gentleman's lodgings were viewed as a peculiar kind of moral laboratory. To the outside world, these rooms were draped in a fog of mystery and tobacco smoke. There was a prevailing superstition that a man left to his own devices would eventually revert to a state of prehistoric chaos. Without a woman to curate the parlor, it was assumed that the bachelor would inevitably eat his dinner off a mantelpiece, sleep in his boots, and allow his collection of dust to form its own sentient government. The superstition of the unaired soul. For the voice generator, observe the semicolons, for the intellectual pauses. The most pervasive superstition regarding the bachelor was the theory of stagnation. It was widely believed that a man living alone did not breathe fresh air. Since he had no wife to order the windows opened, his rooms were thought to be filled with moral miasma. Neighbors would pass a bachelor's lodging and glance at the heavy, velvet curtains with a mixture of pity and dread. If the curtains remained closed until noon, it wasn't just seen as late sleeping. No, it was a red flag of melancholic decay. The superstition held that solitude turned a man's blood into a sluggish, dark ink, making him prone to eccentricities, radical political ideas, or worst of all, an interest in French novels. The moral gatekeeper. In the absence of a wife, the bachelor's life was governed by a substitute authority figure, the landlady. She was the high priestess of propriety. Her role was not just to collect rent, but to act as a human surveillance system for the gentleman's soul. A landlady had a superstitious belief in the order of the boot. If a gentleman's boots were found outside his door in a state of extreme muddiness, it was a sign of a reckless night. If they were too clean, he was suspiciously idle. The landlady's most potent weapon was the dust test. To a Victorian landlady, a layer of dust on a gentleman's bookshelf was not just a lack of cleaning, it was a symptom of a soul in crisis. She believed that if she didn't enter his rooms to straighten up at least once a day, the gentleman would literally dissolve into a pile of laundry and bad habits. She was the only thing standing between him and total social annihilation. The cursed bachelor dinner. There was a profound superstition regarding what a man ate when he was alone. A gentleman dining in his lodgings was expected to suffer. If he were found enjoying a high-quality steak and a fine claret while alone, he was seen as a hedonistic threat. The Victorian ideal of the bachelor was the struggling scholar, a man who ate cold mutton and dry toast while staring at a candle. Anything more enjoyable was considered a red flag of moral laxity. People believed that if a man learned to cook for himself, he would never marry because he had unlocked the secret of domestic independence. This was the Victorian nightmare, a man who didn't need a household to be happy. Therefore, society did its best to make sure the bachelor's dinner was as lonely and miserable as possible. The superstition of the wild library. The bachelor's bookshelf was another source of intense scrutiny. A married man's library was curated for the family, but a bachelor's library was dangerous. There was a superstition that books read in solitude had a different effect on the brain. Reading Darwin or Marx while surrounded by the laughter of a family was safe, but reading them alone in a dim lodging was a recipe for brain fever. The bachelor's burden was the weight of his own thoughts, unmediated by the softening influence of a feminine presence. For the AI narrator, emphasized the word softening with a slightly sarcastic lilt. The Victorians truly believed that women acted as a kind of human filter for heavy ideas. Without that filter, a man's brain was at risk of combustion. The American bachelor, the rugged danger. In America, the superstition took a slightly more rugged turn. While the British bachelor was feared for becoming a hermit, the American bachelor was feared for becoming a pioneer of vice. In the boarding houses of New York, the single man was seen as a transient soul. He had no roots, therefore he had no character. The burden of the American bachelor was the constant need to prove his respectability. He had to attend church twice as often, tip his hat twice as high, and never ever be seen carrying a bottle of anything, even milk, after dark. To be alone in a city of millions was to be a predator until proven otherwise. The ritual of the evening call. To survive the superstitions, the bachelor had to perform the empty performance of socialization. Even if he wanted to stay home and read, he was required to make calls. He would put on his finest coat, leave his lonely lodgings, and go to someone else's house just to sit in their parlor and be witnessed. This was his social tax. By appearing in public, he was telling society, "See, I am not a hermit. I have not forgotten how to use a spoon. I am still one of you." Once he returned to his dark, dusty rooms, the burden returned. He would sit in his solitary chair, light his pipe, and contemplate the bizarre reality that in the 19th century, a man's home was not his castle. It was a glass box under the constant inspection of a world that was terrified of a man who could stand his own company. Conclusion: the ghost in the lodgings. The bachelor's burden was ultimately the burden of being a half-person. The Victorian era did not recognize the individual, it only recognized the unit. A man without a wife was a broken unit, a fragment of a machine that had no purpose. When we look back at the superstitions surrounding these single men, we aren't just looking at old-fashioned gossip. We are looking at a society that was fundamentally afraid of the unaccompanied life. They built a world of rules to ensure that no one man or woman could ever truly be alone. The paper witness. In the quiet, candlelit corners of the Victorian home, there existed a feverish, almost frantic activity that took place every night before sleep. It was not prayer, though it possessed a similar intensity. It was the act of journaling. To the modern observer, a diary is a place for secrets or a tool for mental health. But to the Victorian, the journal was something much more urgent. It was a paper witness. The Victorians lived with a haunting, persistent fear, the fear of the unrecorded life. They felt an overwhelming need to document every private thought, every minor ailment, and every fleeting interaction, not because they were narcissists, but because they were terrified of dying alone and leaving no evidence of their moral struggle. If a thought was not written down on high-quality rag paper, did it even happen? To a Victorian, the answer was a resounding no. The architecture of the private page. For the voice generator, treat the semicolons as a contemplative breath. The Victorian diary was not a messy notebook, it was a formal ledger of the soul. There was a specific etiquette to the entry. One did not simply write, "I felt sad today." That would be too raw, too unaccompanied. Instead, one wrote, "Observed a profound heaviness of spirit this afternoon, likely due to the overcast sky and a lack of improving conversation." They translated their emotions into a language that could be read by a stranger. This is the great Victorian irony. Even in their most private thoughts, they were writing for an imaginary audience. They were writing letters to no one, yet they polished their prose as if the Queen herself might stumble upon their desk. They were performing solitude, even when they were the only ones in the room. The superstition of the sudden end. Why this obsession? It stemmed from a morbid, yet practical superstition regarding death. In an era where a simple infection or a chill could end a life in 48 hours, the diary served as a spiritual black box. The Victorians believed that if they died alone, the diary would speak for them. It would prove to the world that they were respectable, that they were disciplined, and that they had spent their solitary hours in improvement rather than idleness. A blank diary was a social disaster. It suggested a blank mind, or worse, a mind filled with thoughts so scandalous they could not be committed to paper. For the AI narrator, emphasized the word idleness with a tone of mock horror. To the Victorians, an idle mind was not just a playground for the devil. It was a red flag that you were probably a radical or a poet, both of which were equally dangerous. The ink-stained solitude. The physical act of journaling was a way to navigate the scandal of being alone. If you were sitting alone in a room doing nothing, you were a problem. But if you were sitting alone in a room writing, you were a scholar. The pen was a chaperone. It gave the solitary individual a reason to exist without a companion. This led to the journaling mania of the 1870s, where people documented the most mundane details of their existence with the gravity of a court reporter. They recorded what they ate, the exact time the postman arrived, and the precise temperature of the parlor. This was data-driven solitude. By turning their loneliness into a series of statistics, they felt they had conquered it. They weren't lonely, they were conducting a longitudinal study of their own existence. The American version, the frontier of the self. In America, the obsession with journaling took on a more pioneer spirit. On the vast plains of the West, where solitude was not a social choice but a geographic reality, the diary became a lifeline. For an American woman living in a sod house in Kansas, the diary was her only social circle. She wrote letters to a dear diary who was more real to her than her neighbors 10 miles away. These American journals were less about moral improvement and more about survival documentation. They were shouting into the void, "I am here, I am still sane. I have not forgotten how to use a semicolon." The American audience of the time viewed the diary as a manifesto of the individual. While the British used the diary to prove they were good, the Americans used it to prove they were there. The secret codes of the heart. Despite the formal prose, the Victorians did have secrets. To keep these secrets safe from prying eyes, like the ever-curious landlady or the snooping chaperone, they developed ciphers of solitude. They would write certain words in Greek, or use a shorthand that looked like bird scratches. This created a room within a room. The diary was a physical object in the house, but its contents were a private fortress. If a young lady wrote the symbol for Venus next to a gentleman's name, she was committing a radical act of rebellion. She was enjoying a private thought that no chaperone could monitor. This was the only place where the Victorian red flag could be lowered, if only for a few ink-stained pages. Conclusion: the immortality of the ink. The obsession with journaling eventually faded as the 20th century brought the telephone and the quick note. We stopped writing for the invisible guest and started communicating in the moment. But there is something haunting about those Victorian volumes. They represent a world that was terrified of silence. They felt they had to fill every empty hour with a sentence and every solitary thought with a witness. They were letters to no one, yet they were written with the hope that, somewhere in the future, someone would read them and realize that being alone was the hardest work they ever did. The danger of the silent page. In the modern era, we consider reading to be one of the most innocent forms of solitude. A person curled up with a book is the very picture of peace. But in the 19th century, reading alone was viewed with the same suspicion we might reserve today for a teenager experimenting with high explosives. To the Victorians, a book was not just an object, it was a stimulant. And like any stimulant, it was believed that if consumed without a witness, it could lead to the total collapse of the reader's moral and physical health. There existed a forbidden reading list, not necessarily of books that were banned by the government, but of books that were considered too stimulating to be read in private. If you were a young lady found alone with a sensation novel, or a gentleman devouring French philosophy without a chaperone nearby, you weren't just reading, you were flirting with madness. The medical theory of brain overheating. For the voice generator, pay close attention to the M-dashes. They provide the sarcastic beats of the narrator. Victorian doctors, men who believed that most illnesses could be cured by a brisk walk and a lack of imagination, had a specific theory about reading alone. They believed the human brain had a limited amount of vital energy. Reading a book that was too exciting, too romantic, or too thought-provoking caused the blood to rush to the head with such force that it could lead to brain fever. If a person read these books in a group, the social interaction acted as a cooling mechanism. The conversation vented the mental steam, but to read alone, that was to create a pressure cooker of the mind. The red flag was raised the moment a reader began to blush or sigh while turning the pages. This was seen as a physiological warning that the book was winning and the reader's soul was losing. The sensation novel, scandal. The primary villain on the forbidden reading list was the sensation novel. These were the thrillers of the 1860s, books filled with bigamy, secret murders, and women with shocks of golden hair and even more shocking secrets. Authors like Wilkie Collins and Mary Elizabeth Braddon were seen as the pushers of a dangerous drug. The superstition was that these books were particularly dangerous for women. It was believed that a woman's nervous system was too delicate to handle the plot twists of the woman in white without a sturdy aunt in the room to ground her in reality. To be unaccompanied with a thriller was to invite hysteria. For the AI narrator, emphasized the word hysteria with a dry, academic lilt. To the Victorians, hysteria was the catch-all diagnosis for any woman who dared to have an interesting thought while sitting by herself. The French Connection, a language of sin. If a book was written in French, it was automatically assumed to be too stimulating. The Victorians had a complicated relationship with their neighbours across the Channel. They admired French fashion, but they were terrified of French fiction. Reading Gustave Flaubert or Honoré de Balzac alone was considered a gateway to moral decay. There was a persistent belief that the French language contained certain frequencies of passion that could bypass the British stiff upper lip. Therefore, if a gentleman wished to read French literature, he was expected to do so in the public library or his club, where the presence of other men would prevent him from becoming too French in his private thoughts. The anatomy of the witnessed read. Because of these fears, the Victorians invented the family reading circle. This was the social antidote to the forbidden list. The father would sit in the center of the room and read aloud from safe authors like Charles Dickens, mostly, or Sir Walter Scott. By reading aloud, the stimulation was shared. It was diluted. No one was allowed to have a private emotional reaction. If a character died, the whole family cried together, a regulated, synchronized display of emotion. This prevented anyone from developing individual interpretation, which the Victorians viewed as the cousin of social anarchy. If you were a solo reader, someone who preferred to take their book to the garden or the attic, you were viewed as a rebel. You were suspected of secret thinking, which was the most dangerous kind of thinking there was. Reading for the soul. In America, the rules were slightly different. While the East Coast elites tried to copy the British witnessed raid, the vastness of the American landscape made solitude inevitable. However, the forbidden list still existed in the form of religious tracts. In many American households, reading a novel on a Sunday, even with a witness, was a red flag. The only book that was safe for solo consumption was the Bible. Anything else was a vain diversion. The American audience of the 19th century was obsessed with self-improvement. This created a paradox. They wanted to read to get ahead, but they were afraid that reading the wrong thing would lead them astray. This led to the creation of approved reading lists by local libraries, the 19th century version of an algorithm designed to keep your thoughts within the boundaries of the proper. The under-the-pillow culture. Of course, the more you forbid a book, the more people want to read it in secret. This led to the under-the-pillow culture. Young men and women became experts at hiding, stimulating literature. A copy of Jane Eyre, considered by some to be far too intense for a solitary girl, would be hidden under a mattress. A gentleman might hide a volume of radical philosophy inside the hollowed-out cover of a book about the history of turnips. The irony is that the Victorians created the very excitement they were trying to prevent. By making reading a scandalous act, they made every page turn feel like a revolution. To read alone was to be a spy in your own house. Conclusion: the freedom of the private page. By the end of the century, the forbidden reading list began to crumble. The rise of mass-market paperbacks and the New Woman movement made it impossible to monitor what everyone was reading. But the legacy of the stimulated reader remains. We still feel a slight, subconscious guilt when we ignore the world to get lost in a book. We are the descendants of a people who believed that a story was a dangerous thing, and that being alone with a story was the most dangerous thing of all. The greenhouse of suspicion. In the meticulously manicured world of the mid-1800s, the garden was a place of profound atmospheric tension. To the modern eye, a garden is a sanctuary of peace, a place to escape the hum of electronics and the weight of society. But to the Victorian, the garden was a tactical battlefield of reputation. There was a razor-thin, almost invisible line between solitude, which was a poetic necessity, and seclusion, which was a moral red flag. If you were a young woman found sitting under a willow tree with a sketchpad, you were enjoying a moment of artistic solitude. However, if you were found sitting under that same tree without a sketchpad, without a book, and without a visible purpose, you were in a state of seclusion. In the Victorian vocabulary, seclusion was merely a polite word for waiting for a secret lover. To be alone in nature was to be under the most intense form of social surveillance, for nature was believed to be a co-conspirator in the downfall of human virtue. The architecture of the accidental encounter. For the voice generator, take a long breath at every M-dash. These are the moments of dry, historical irony. Victorian gardens were not designed for privacy, they were designed for the illusion of privacy. Hedges were kept at a specific height, high enough to feel cozy, but low enough for a determined aunt to see over them from the second-story window. This was the panopticon of the peonies. The most dangerous feature of any Victorian estate was the garden gate. A solitary walk toward the perimeter of the property was viewed with the same suspicion as a modern-day security breach. If a lady wandered too close to the gate unaccompanied, it was assumed she was either planning an escape or expecting a delivery of forbidden letters. The superstition was that solitude in a garden was like a gas. it would inevitably expand until it met another person, and that person was almost certainly someone your father would disapprove of. The loitering lady and the tool of purpose. A lady could never simply be in a garden. To sit on a bench and stare at the clouds was a sign of a vacant mind, and a vacant mind was considered a petri dish for hysteria. To protect her reputation while alone, a lady had to carry a prop of respectability. Usually, this was a basket and a pair of pruning shears. As long as she was cutting roses, she was a productive member of society. She could spend 3 hours in the garden, provided she actually brought back 3 roses. The labor justified the loneliness, but if she returned empty-handed, the red flag was raised. Empty hands suggested that her mind had been busy with original thoughts, which were the 19th century equivalent of an unsecured network. For the AI narrator, emphasized the word original with a hint of mock scandal. To the Victorians, an original thought was something you only had if you were either a genius or a criminal, and society wasn't willing to bet on the former. The American garden, space, transcendentalism, and terror. In the United States, particularly in the sprawling estates of the Hudson Valley or the quiet gardens of New England, the rules of the garden took on a spiritual, yet equally paranoid tone. The Americans were influenced by the transcendentalists, people like Emerson and Thoreau, who claimed that being alone in nature was the highest form of human existence. But the American elite was still terrified of the unaccompanied woman. In Boston, a woman could walk in her garden to commune with the oversoul, but she had better be back by tea time, and she had better not look too happy about it. The gossip in the garden in America was centered around the fear of eccentricity. If you spent too much time alone with your petunias, you weren't seen as a mystic, you were seen as someone who was losing their grip on the practicalities of the Republic. The geography of virtue. The most bizarre unwritten rule of Victorian gardening was the sightline. A person was allowed to be alone in the garden, provided they remained within the optical reach of the house. If you disappeared behind a heavy thicket of rhododendrons, the social clock started ticking. You had approximately 5 minutes of invisibility credit. After that, it was expected that a servant or a relative would accidentally wander out to check on the weather. This wasn't because they were worried you had fallen, it was because they were worried you were standing. Standing still and thinking was a radical act of defiance. The language of flowers as a security risk. We often think of the language of flowers as a romantic Victorian hobby, but in the context of being alone in a garden, it was seen as a security risk. Every flower had a meaning, and therefore, every bouquet was a potential encrypted telegram. If a lady was seen alone picking yellow roses, infidelity, or purple columbine, resolved to win, the gossips would have enough material for a month of dinner parties. Solitude was never truly silent. The flowers were talking behind your back. The red flag wasn't just in your behavior, it was in the very petals you touched. Conclusion: the managed wilderness. The Victorian garden was a metaphor for the Victorian soul, beautiful, highly managed, and absolutely forbidden from growing wild. They loved nature, but they feared what nature did to a person who had no one to talk to. They knew that in the silence of the garden, the self would begin to speak, and that was the one voice the Victorian era wanted to drown out. Today, when we walk in a park with our headphones on, we are the fulfillment of the Victorian nightmare. We are truly alone, truly unobserved, and truly in seclusion. To a Victorian ghost, we are all women and men of the night, wandering in the darkness of our own thoughts, without a single pruning shear to justify our existence. The terror of the idle hand. In the modern world, we celebrate doing nothing. We call it self-care, we call it rotting on the sofa, we call it a well-deserved break. But in the 1880s, to be idle was not a luxury, it was a moral catastrophe. The Victorians were haunted by a singular, terrifying proverb: idle hands are the devil's workshop. To be alone and unproductive was to invite a spiritual invasion. Therefore, if a Victorian found themselves in a parlour without company, they could not simply sit and think. They had to engage in the parlour game of one. This was the art of entertaining oneself with such intense, visible effort that any passing servant or nosy neighbour would think, "Look at that person, they are working very hard at their leisure." It was a performative solitude, where the goal was to stay so busy that the devil couldn't find a place to sit down. The taxonomy of the productive hobby. For the voice generator, treat the semicolons as a pompous pause and the em-dashes as a comedic reveal. If you were a lady alone in a parlour, you were expected to be a whirlwind of needlework. You did not just sew, you attacked the fabric with a ferocity that suggested the fate of the empire depended on a doily. This was the busybody defense. If you were knitting, your mind was occupied. If you were embroidering, your eyes were focused. As long as the needle was moving, the red flag of idleness remained lowered. But what happened if you didn't like sewing? Then you moved to the more bizarre solitary games. There was the arrangement of ferns, a hobby that involved spending 3 hours moving a single plant 2 inches to the left, then 2 inches to the right, or the cataloguing of shells, where a person would sit alone, labeling every tiny seashell with a Latin name they had likely made up. These weren't just hobbies, they were morality shields. The intellectual toy. A gentleman alone in his study or parlour faced a different set of rules. He could not be seen playing, he had to be experimenting. This gave birth to the Victorian obsession with scientific novelties. He would sit alone with a stereoscope, a device that made 2-dimensional photos look 3-dimensional. To the modern eye, he looks like a man with a VR headset, but to the Victorian, he was expanding his geographical knowledge. He wasn't looking at a picture of a mountain because it was pretty. No, he was studying the topography of the Alps. Then there was the solitary microscope. A man could spend an entire afternoon looking at the leg of a flea. Was he bored? No. Was he lonely? Certainly not. He was engaging with the wonders of the natural world. The key to being alone was to make sure your leisure looked exactly like a job. If you were having too much fun, you were doing it wrong. Solitaire as a moral test. One of the few games a person was actually allowed to play alone was patience, known in America as solitaire. But even this was viewed through a lens of suspicion. The Victorians didn't see solitaire as a game, they saw it as a trial of character. If you cheated at solitaire while alone, it was a sign of a deep, rotting moral core. The superstition was that if you would lie to yourself about a card game, you would lie to the Queen about a tax return. For the AI narrator, use a tone of mock seriousness here. Imagine a man in a dark room, sweating over a deck of cards, terrified that if he moves a king to an empty slot unfairly, his soul will be forfeit. This was the parlor game of one at its most neurotic. The witness wasn't a person, it was God, and apparently, God was very concerned about your card-sorting skills. The self-made solitude. In the United States, the parlor game of one took on a more enterprising flavor. Americans were less worried about the devil and more worried about self-improvement. An American alone in a parlor was likely practicing elocution, standing in front of a mirror and reciting speeches by Abraham Lincoln to an audience of chairs. Or perhaps they were practicing phrenology on themselves, feeling the bumps on their own heads to determine if they were destined for greatness or the poorhouse. The American red flag for solitude was lack of ambition. If an American was alone and not getting ahead, they were failing the Republic. This led to the busyness that still defines American culture today. We don't have hobbies anymore, we have side hustles. That is a direct inheritance from the Victorian parlor, where even your private time had to have a return on investment. The piano as a wall. Perhaps the greatest game of one was the piano. A lady alone would play for hours, but she wasn't playing for the music, she was playing to fill the silence. Silence was the scandal. Silence suggested that no one was talking, and if no one was talking, something was wrong. The piano provided a soundtrack of stability. As long as the neighbors could hear Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, they knew that the household was functioning correctly. The moment the music stopped, the gossip engine started. Why is she silent? Is she thinking? Is she idle? Conclusion: the exhaustion of being alone. By the time the Victorian era ended, the parlor game of one had exhausted an entire generation. They had spent their lives working at their rest. They had turned every hobby into a chore and every quiet moment into a performance. Today we have the ultimate parlor game of one, the smartphone. We can be alone in a room and look busier than a Victorian factory worker. We are constantly cataloguing, Instagram, writing letters, Twitter, and studying the world, Wikipedia. We have finally succeeded in making sure we are never, ever idle. The Victorians would be so proud, and we are so very tired. The iron box of anxiety. In the middle of the 19th century, the world was shrinking. The steam engine was the great conqueror of distance, a mechanical beast that turned days of carriage travel into mere hours of iron-clattering speed. But for the Victorian traveller, the railway introduced a new, visceral, and utterly terrifying psychological crisis. This was the railway carriage panic. Unlike the modern train, with its open aisles and bustling snack cars, the early Victorian train was a series of isolated, locked compartments. Once the conductor turned the key and the train lurched forward, you were sealed in a wooden box. If you were alone, you faced the scandal of solitude. But if you were with one other person, you were trapped in a tin can of potential catastrophe. To be alone with a stranger at 60 miles per hour was not just a travel inconvenience, it was a red flag of existential proportions. The anatomy of the silent compartment. For the voice generator, treat the semicolons as a suspenseful breath and the em-dashes as a revelation pause. The etiquette of the Victorian railway compartment was a masterpiece of repression. Two strangers sitting opposite each other, their knees mere inches apart, were expected to behave as if they were on different planets. You could not speak. Speaking was intrusive. You could not stare. Staring was aggressive. Instead, travelers engaged in the Great Paper Shield. They would unfurl their newspapers, the massive broadsheet pages of the Times, until they were completely encased in a fortress of ink and news. If the person opposite you shifted their weight, you tightened your grip on the paper. If they cleared their throat, your heart rate spiked. The superstition was simple. Every stranger in a train compartment was a potential dangerous lunatic or a secret assassin until the train reached the next station. The Muller case and the birth of paranoia. Why were they so afraid? It wasn't just imagination. In 1864, a man named Franz Muller committed the first railway murder in British history, robbing and killing a gentleman in a closed compartment and disappearing before the next stop. This sent the Victorian world into a tailspin of compartment fever. Suddenly, every bearded man in a top hat was a suspect. The red flag was now a literal life-or-death concern. Inventors began filing patents for railway communication cords and communication windows so that travelers could peer into the next compartment to ensure their neighbors weren't being strangled. But until those inventions were perfected, the traveler was alone with the tin can panic. For the AI narrator emphasized the word locked with a hint of dread. In the Victorian mind, a locked door was the end of civilization and the beginning of the jungle of human nature. The ladies' only refuge. For a woman, the railway was a social minefield. To be trapped in a compartment with a single gentleman was to risk her reputation and her safety. The 10-yard rule of the street didn't work when the walls were 2 feet away. This led to the creation of ladies-only carriages. These were seen as sanctuaries of propriety. However, the superstition followed them even there. What if a man dressed as a lady entered the carriage? What if the lady sitting next to you was actually a notorious jewel thief? The Victorian woman travelling alone was a red flag to herself. She carried protection devices, which often included a specialized railway dagger disguised as a fan, or more commonly, a bottle of smelling salts to be used the moment a man so much as mentioned the weather. To be unaccompanied in a tin can was to be a victim in waiting. The wild west of the rails. Across the Atlantic, the American experience was slightly different, but no less neurotic. American trains often had open-plan cars, the aisles of democracy, which solved the locked box problem, but created the stranger overload problem. In the United States, the panic wasn't about being murdered in secret, it was about being scammed in public. The confidence man was the American version of the railway ghost. He was a man who would sit next to you, offer you a cigar, and by the time you reached Ohio, you had bought a deed to a non-existent gold mine. For the American audience, the red flag was excessive friendliness. If a man smiled at you on a train, he wasn't being nice, he was a predator of the purse. The American traveler developed a cold gaze that would make a British butler look like a circus clown. The railway spine and the nervous collapse. Victorian doctors even invented a medical condition for the stress of train travel, railway spine. They believed that the vibrations of the train, combined with the psychological terror of being trapped with strangers, caused the spinal cord to jiggle out of place. If you arrived at your destination feeling shaky, it wasn't just because the train was bumpy, it was because your nervous system had been overstimulated by the constant surveillance of your fellow travelers. The cure, you guessed it, morbid seclusion in a dark room until the animal spirits settled back down. Conclusion, the end of the tin can. By the late 1800s, the corridor train was introduced. Passengers could finally walk from one end of the train to the other. The tin can was opened. The panic subsided, but it didn't disappear. It just evolved. We still feel it today when we enter an elevator with a stranger. We look at the floor, we check our phones, we count the seconds until the door opens. We are the descendants of those Victorian travelers, trapped in our own digital tin cans, terrified of the scandal of a real conversation, and forever watching for the red flag in the eyes of the person sitting opposite us. The architecture of grief. In the modern era, we view grief as a messy, unpredictable, and deeply private emotion. We are told to take our time and process our feelings. But to the Victorians, grief was not a feeling, it was a military operation. It was a highly regulated public performance with a strict schedule, a specific uniform, and a set of rules that turned solitude into a fashion statement. In the 19th century, you were not allowed to be alone just because you were sad. You were allowed to be alone because the calendar said so. This was the mourning period, a time when your social isolation was measured in inches of black crepe and the number of months you stayed away from a ballroom. To the Victorian mind, if you didn't look lonely, you weren't grieving, and if you weren't grieving correctly, you were a moral red flag of the highest order. The uniform of despair. For the voice generator, treat the semicolons as a somma pause and the em-dashes as a revealing beat. The centerpiece of Victorian mourning was the fabric known as crepe, a scratchy, uncomfortable and heavy silk that looked like a prune and felt like a punishment. A widow was expected to wear full mourning for a year and a day. During this time, she was effectively a ghost in her own house. She was unaccompanied by choice, but she was never truly private. Her clothes were a billboard that shouted, "I am in a state of government-mandated loneliness." She could not wear jewelry unless it was made from the hair of the deceased. Think about that for a moment. To prove you were a poetic soul rather than a dangerous lunatic, you had to wear a necklace made of your dead husband's whiskers. If you were found wearing a sparkling diamond while in deep mourning, it wasn't just a fashion faux pas, it was a scandal. It suggested that your heart was not sufficiently heavy, and in the 1870s, a light heart was a social crime. The timeline of isolation. The Victorians had a stopwatch for sadness. Solitude was divided into 3 stages: full mourning, second mourning, and half mourning. In full mourning, you were a hermit. You did not go to dinners, you did not go to the theatre, you barely went to church. You were the solitary chair personified. However, as the months ticked by, you were allowed to slowly bleed colour back into your life. In second mourning, you could add a bit of white or grey. By half mourning, you were allowed lavender or mauve. For the AI narrator, emphasize the word mauve with a hint of sarcasm. To a Victorian, wearing mauve was like shouting, "I am ready to party," to the entire neighbourhood. It was the signal that your period of approved solitude was coming to an end. If you stayed in black for too long, you were morbid. If you left it too early, you were callous. There was no winning, there was only the clock. The Merry Widow myth. The greatest fear of the Victorian era was the Merry Widow. This was a woman who enjoyed her solitude too much. Because a widow had her own money and no husband to chaperone her, she was the ultimate unaccompanied female. Society viewed her with a mixture of jealousy and terror. The mourning rules were designed to keep her contained. The heavy veil, which was often 3 feet long, was not just to hide her tears, it was to hide her eyes. It was a portable solitary confinement. If she lifted her veil in public, she was flirting with the world. The American audience of the Gilded Age took these rules and made them even more theatrical. In New York society, mourning was a competitive sport. Who could have the blackest carriage? Who could have the most elaborate mourning stationery with the thickest black borders? In America, being alone after death was a way to show off your wealth. "Look at how much I can afford to not go outside," was the unspoken message. The professional griever, the mute. If you were truly wealthy and truly alone, you could hire people to be lonely with you. These were called mutes. They were men paid to stand outside your house during a funeral, with a look of profound, professional misery. They were the props of solitude. They ensured that even if you were the only person mourning, the street would think you had a battalion of heartbroken supporters. This is the peak Victorian absurdity, hiring strangers to look sad so that you don't have to be unaccompanied in your grief. The empty room, solitude as a museum. When a patriarch died, his room was often turned into a shrine of solitude. The clock was stopped at the moment of death, the mirror was covered in black cloth, and the solitary chair was never sat in again. This was the red flag of physical space. The Victorians believed that by keeping a room alone, they were keeping the spirit of the person alive. It was a museum of loneliness. If a servant accidentally moved a book or opened a curtain, it was seen as an act of spiritual vandalism. The solitude of the room was sacred, because the Victorians feared the erasure of memory almost as much as they feared the idle hand. Conclusion: the freedom of the black veil. Eventually, the Great War would kill the mourning industry. When death became too common, the black crepe became too heavy to bear. We moved into the modern era, where we wear black for a day and then get back to work. But there was a strange power in the Victorian mourning period. It gave people a permission slip to be alone. In a society that hated solitude, the mourning veil was the only get-out-of-jail-free card. You could sit in your garden, you could stare pensively at a wall, and no one could call you idle or hysterical. You were simply in mourning. Today we have lost the uniform, but we have also lost the protection. We are expected to be fine within a week. Perhaps, in our rush to escape the scandal of the black crepe, we have forgotten that sometimes a person just needs a heavy veil and a year of silence to find themselves again. The Sabbath of stillness. In our modern world, Sunday is a day of brunch, digital scrolling, and frantic preparation for the work week. It is a day of noise, but for the Victorian, Sunday was a vast, echoing canyon of mandatory silence. It was the Sabbath, a day when the gears of the British Empire and the hustle of the American Republic ground to a screeching halt. This was not merely a day of rest, it was a day of religious incarceration. For the solitary individual, a Victorian Sunday was not a break, it was a quiet prison. To be alone on a Tuesday was suspicious, but to be alone on a Sunday was a spiritual test. Every activity that brought joy, from whistling a tune to playing a game of cards, was suddenly draped in a black cloth of Sabbatarianism. If you weren't praying, and you weren't in church, you were expected to be sitting in your chair, contemplating your sins in a silence so thick you could hear the dust settling on the mantelpiece. The architecture of restricted joy. For the voice generator, treat the semicolons as a solemn pause and the em-dashes as a revealing beat. The rules of Sunday silence were a masterpiece of domestic misery. In many households, especially in the evangelical circles of London and the blue law towns of New England, the piano was locked. The toys of the children were put away in a cupboard, as if the sight of a wooden horse might offend the creator. Reading was permitted, but only improving literature. You could read the Bible, you could read a book of sermons, but if you were caught alone with a copy of Oliver Twist, that was a red flag of the highest order. Imagine the solitary Victorian sitting in his parlour. The street outside is silent, no carriages, no shouting vendors, no life. The only sound is the heavy, rhythmic clunk of the grandfather clock. To the lonely mind, that clock wasn't just measuring time, it was counting the seconds until you were allowed to have a personality again. It was a day where solitude became seclusion, and seclusion was enforced by the law of the land. The cold meat rule, a culinary penance. One of the most bizarre aspects of Sunday silence was the cold meat rule. To ensure that servants also rested, though their version of rest usually involved even more cleaning, no hot food was to be cooked on the Sabbath. The solitary diner was forced to face a plate of cold mutton and congealed gravy. Eating a warm, delicious meal alone on a Sunday was seen as a hedonistic rebellion. The meal was designed to be as dull as the sermons. The superstition was that if you enjoyed your food too much, you weren't focusing on your soul. Thus, the Sunday meal became a taste-free solitude. For the AI narrator, emphasized the words congealed gravy with a hint of genuine disgust. This was the culinary equivalent of a hair shirt. The Sunday walk and the scandal of pace. You were allowed to go for a walk on Sunday, but it was a walk of woe. You could not run, you could not skip, and heaven forbid, you could not look as if you were enjoying the fresh air. It was the Sabbath stroll, a slow, methodical movement that suggested you were walking toward a funeral rather than a park. If you were a gentleman walking alone, you had to keep your head down. If you looked too happy, the Sunday police, usually the local gossips, would assume you were heading toward a secret rendezvous or a hidden tavern. The red flag was joy. On Sunday, joy was a symptom of a weak character. The only acceptable emotion was pious exhaustion. The policing of the soul. In the United States, Sunday silence was often written into the actual law. In states like Connecticut or Massachusetts, the blue laws made it illegal to do almost anything secular on a Sunday. For the American audience, the Sunday silence was a community-wide surveillance project. If your chimney produced too much smoke on a Sunday morning, people wondered if you were working. If you were seen alone in your garden, you were suspected of worldliness. The American Sunday was a day where the scandal of being alone was at its peak, because the community expected you to be in the pews. If you stayed home, the silence of your house was a loud confession of your lack of faith. The nervous Sunday collapse. Victorian doctors observed a phenomenon they called Sunday spleen, a type of depression brought on by the sudden, total lack of stimulation. A person who was busy all week suddenly found themselves trapped in a quiet prison with nothing but their own thoughts. Without the parlor games of one or the forbidden reading list, the mind would begin to eat itself. This is where the solitary chair became a danger. People would sit and stare at the walls until they began to hallucinate moral failures. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum that sucked the sanity right out of the room. Conclusion: the echoes of the Sabbath. By the late Victorian era, the Sunday silence began to crack. The opening of museums on Sundays was a scandal that shook the foundations of society. People wanted to see art, they wanted to hear music, they wanted to escape the quiet prison. Today we have the opposite problem. We have no silence. We have Sunday scaries, the anxiety of the coming week, but we drown it in podcasts and notifications. We have lost the cold mutton and the locked piano, but we have also lost the ability to sit in a room for 6 hours with nothing but our own souls. The Victorian Sunday was a prison, yes, but it was a prison that forced you to get to know the stranger living inside your own head. The luxury of a closed door. In the modern world, we take the bedroom door for granted. We consider it a basic human right to walk into a room, turn a key, and vanish from the world. But in the 19th century, privacy was not a right, it was a luxury. For the vast majority of the population, being alone was a status symbol that only the wealthy could afford. If you were poor or middle class, you lived in a house of 12. A crowded, bustling, noisy hive where every breath was witnessed and every thought was interrupted. The bedroom barrier was the ultimate social divide. To the rich, a bedroom was a sanctuary for the art of the pensive stare. To everyone else, it was a dormitory where you shared your dreams and your snoring with 3 siblings, a cousin, and perhaps a stray lodger. In this world, the scandal of being alone was impossible to commit, simply because there was nowhere to be alone in. The architecture of intimacy and interference. For the voice generator, treat the semicolons as a contemplative pause and the em-dashes as a revealing beat. Consider the typical Victorian terrace house. The walls were thin, the floorboards were musical, and the concept of personal space had not yet been invented. In a house of 12, the solitary chair was a myth. If you sat down, someone else sat on you. If you tried to read a forbidden book, 3 people were looking over your shoulder to see if it had pictures. Privacy was a vertical concept. The higher up you were in the house, the more alone you could be. The servants lived in the attic, often 3 to a bed, while the master of the house had his own dressing room, his own study, and his own bedroom. For the elite, solitude was a fashion statement. For the poor, it was a financial impossibility. The red flag of being unaccompanied was something only the rich had the time to worry about. If a poor man was alone, it usually meant he was out of work, which was a much more practical tragedy. The bed curtain, the poor man's fortress. When you cannot afford a wall, you buy a curtain. This was the primary bedroom barrier for the middle classes. The heavy, velvet, or linen bed curtains were not just for keeping out the cold, though the Victorian air was indeed a vengeful beast, they were for creating a microkingdom of one. Inside the curtains, for 10 minutes before sleep, you were finally unaccompanied. You could whisper to yourself, you could think a private thought, or you could simply exist without being bumped into. But even here, the gossip of the house was never far away. The Victorians were experts at audio surveillance. They could tell who was tossing and turning, who was crying, and who was secretly eating a biscuit by the sound of the crumbs hitting the sheets. Privacy was a thin fabric, and it was easily torn. The dressing room as a psychological safety valve. For the wealthy American or British gentleman, the dressing room was the ultimate solution to the crowded house. It was a room where no one, not even his wife, was allowed to enter without an invitation. This was the only place where a man could truly lower his stiff upper lip. He could look in the mirror without performing, he could sigh without being asked if he had the spleen, and he could be idle without the devil setting up a workshop. The dressing room was a psychological airlock. For the AI narrator, emphasized the words psychological airlock with a tone of profound relief. It was the only place where the Victorian self could actually breathe. The new frontier of solitude. It is a hilarious historical fact that the invention of modern plumbing did more for human privacy than any philosophy. Before the dedicated bathroom, washing was a communal affair. A maid brought a basin, a sibling held the towel, a mother checked behind the ears. But as the indoor water closet became a standard feature in the late 1800s, a new sacred space was born. It was the only room in the house where being alone was not only permitted but expected. For the first time in history, a person could lock a door and be legally secluded, without being suspected of a secret rendezvous. The bathroom became the solitary chair of the 20th century. It was the place where the red flag of solitude was finally replaced by the white flag of peace. A social panopticon. In the United States, particularly in cities like Chicago and New York, the House of 12 took the form of the boarding house. Here, young men and women lived together in a state of supervised chaos. The bedroom barrier in a boarding house was a joke. The walls were often made of thin lath and plaster, and the landlady, that high priestess of propriety, had a key to every door. In the American boarding house, solitude was seen as anti-democratic. If you locked your door, you were stuck up. If you spent too much time alone, you were un-American. The red flag here was exclusivity. To be a good American, you had to be constantly visible, constantly chatting, and constantly getting ahead in the presence of others. The ghost in the hallway, the solitary servant. We must not forget the servants. In a house of 12, the servants were the most unaccompanied people of all. Despite never being alone, they were invisible spectators. They saw the scandal in the garden, they heard the whispers behind the bed curtains, and they witnessed the pensive stares of their masters. The servants' solitude was a functional solitude. They were alone in their work, but never in their space. Their bedroom barrier was a tiny cot in a drafty hallway or a shared room in the basement. For them, the scandal of being alone was a dream they couldn't afford to have. The walls we build. By the end of the Victorian era, the desire for privacy had become a fever. We started building houses with more hallways and more doors. We moved away from the House of 12 and toward the nuclear home. We finally won the battle for the bedroom barrier. Today we have all the privacy the Victorians dreamed of. We have our own rooms, our own cars, and our own digital bubbles. And yet, in our perfect solitude, we find ourselves looking for the House of 12 again. We join social networks, we go to crowded coffee shops, we look for witnesses to our lives. We have broken the barrier, but we have discovered that being alone is only a luxury when you have the option to be together. The Victorians were crowded and miserable, but they were never, ever truly alone. The medicalization of the silent room. In the 21st century, if a woman chooses to spend a weekend alone, ordering takeout, reading a novel, and ignoring her phone, we call it recharging. But in the 1870s, such behavior was not seen as a choice, it was seen as a medical emergency. To the Victorian physician, female solitude was a volatile substance. If a woman was left unaccompanied for too long, it was believed her internal organs would literally begin to wander around her body in a fit of boredom. This was the scandal of hysteria. The word hysteria comes from the Greek word for womb, and for the Victorian doctor, every female ailment from a headache to a desire for the right to vote was a symptom of this mysterious, wandering condition. But the ultimate trigger for an attack was solitude. A woman alone was a woman at risk. In the eyes of the medical establishment, the solitary chair was not a seat, it was a diagnostic tool for a nervous breakdown. The thinking woman. For the voice generator, treat the semicolons as a medical pause and the em-dashes as a satirical beat. The Victorian doctor, usually a man with an impressive beard and a terrifying lack of actual biological knowledge, viewed the female brain as a delicate engine with a very small fuel tank. If a woman spent her solitary hours thinking or contemplating the universe, she was believed to be diverting vital energy away from her domestic duties. This led to the red flag of intellectualism. If a woman was found alone with a book of philosophy or a complex mathematical theorem, the doctor would be called immediately. The diagnosis, overstimulation of the cerebrum. The cure, she was forbidden from reading, forbidden from writing, and most importantly, forbidden from being alone. She was placed under medical surveillance, where every sigh was recorded as a symptom and every pensive stare was seen as a sign of encroaching madness. Solitude as a punishment. The most famous and most horrific treatment for the lonely woman was the rest cure, popularized by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell. This was the ultimate Victorian irony. To cure a woman of the ills of solitude, the doctor would lock her in a room for 6 weeks and force her to be absolutely alone. But this wasn't the poetic solitude of the garden. In the rest cure, the patient was forbidden to sit up, forbidden to sew, forbidden to talk, and forbidden to read. She was treated like a human vegetable. The goal was to break her spirit until she begged for the company of her husband and the noise of her children. For the AI narrator, emphasized the words human vegetable with a tone of chilling disbelief. The Victorians believed that by giving a woman too much of the thing she supposedly wanted, solitude, they could reset her into a submissive, domestic state. It wasn't a cure, it was a psychological siege. The vapors and the smell of loneliness. If a woman was found fainting in a parlor while alone, it was attributed to the vapors. This was a vague medical term for something is wrong, but we don't know what. The superstition was that solitude produced a literal gas in the female body, a miasma of the mind, that could only be dispersed by the presence of others. This is why the smelling bottle was the constant companion of the Victorian lady. Whenever she felt the hysteria of being unaccompanied creeping in, she would sniff a bottle of ammonia and lavender. The red flag here was silence. If a woman was too quiet, she was vaporous. If she was too loud, she was hysterical. The only healthy state was to be constantly engaged in light, non-taxing conversation with a chaperone. Essentially, a woman's health was tied to her lack of privacy. The neurasthenic housewife. In America, the medical obsession with female solitude took a slightly more modern turn with the diagnosis of neurasthenia, or American nervousness. As American women in cities like New York began to seek more independence, the doctors pushed back. They claimed that the new American woman was collapsing under the weight of her own brain. Solitude was seen as the breeding ground for unnatural ambitions. For the American audience, the red flag was the woman who preferred a studio to a nursery. The medical establishment warned that if a woman lived alone in a city apartment, her nerves would eventually snap like a violin string. The cure was always the same: go home, stop thinking, and find a witness for your existence. The hysterical drawing room, a theatrical malady. Because the diagnosis of hysteria was so common, it became a kind of social performance. If a woman was feeling overwhelmed by the scandal of being alone, she would perform a hysterical fit. She would laugh, she would cry, she would throw a teacup. This was a brilliant, if desperate, tactical move. By having a fit, she forced the household to pay attention to her. She transformed her invisible solitude into a visible crisis. It was the only way to get a break from the crushing boredom of the Victorian parlour. If the doctor said you were hysterical, you were at least allowed to stay in bed and have people bring you beef tea. It was the 19th century version of a mental health day, but with more corsets and less dignity. The ghost of the yellow wallpaper. By the end of the century, women like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, author of The Yellow Wallpaper, began to speak out against this medical madness. They pointed out that the hysteria wasn't coming from the woman, it was coming from the prison society had built around her. Today, we look back at these Victorian doctors and laugh at their wandering wombs and brain overheating. But we should also remember the red flag they created. They made female independence look like a disease. They turned the solitary chair into a hospital bed. We have won the right to be alone without a doctor's note, but the echoes of hysteria still linger whenever a woman is judged for choosing her own company over the social requirements of the world. The Victorian doctor is dead, but his rest cure still haunts our idea of what a proper woman should be. The paradox of the private page. In the modern world, we think of a diary as the ultimate fortress of the self, a place where we can be ugly, honest, and entirely unaccompanied. But to the Victorian sensibility, privacy was never truly private. It was a performance. Even when a Victorian sat alone in their room, pen in hand, they were writing with the heavy, invisible presence of a future audience looking over their shoulder. This was the performative secret, the act of documenting one's soul as if it were a legal document destined for a public trial. Victorian's secret diary was rarely a chaotic mess of feelings. Instead, it was a carefully curated museum of the ideal self. They didn't write for themselves, they wrote for the ghost of posterity. They lived with the constant, nagging superstition that if they died suddenly, as one often did in the 1800s, their diary would be read by their grieving family, their neighbours, and perhaps even a local newspaper. Consequently, their solitude was a staged play, and the diary was the script. The architecture of the staged thought. For the voice generator, treat the semicolons as a contemplative pause and the em-dashes as a revealing beat. Consider the language of the Victorian journal. One did not simply write, "I had a terrible day and I hate my corset." That would be too raw, too unwitnessed. Instead, the solitary Victorian would write, "Struggled today with a spirit of ungratefulness, prayed for the strength to endure the trials of the domestic sphere with a more cheerful countenance." This wasn't honesty, it was moral branding. They were using their alone time to polish their reputation in case someone broke the lock on their desk. The red flag of being alone was neutralized by the fact that they were working on their character. The diary was a chaperone in paper form, a witness that ensured even their private thoughts remained proper. The deathbed audience. The primary driver of this performative privacy was the deathbed obsession. Victorians were acutely aware that they were one chill away from the grave. They believed that a person's diary was the final evidence of their worth. If a young lady were to pass away and her diary revealed nothing but pensive stares and religious improvement, she would be remembered as a saint. But if her diary revealed that she was bored, angry, or heaven forbid interested in a man without a formal introduction, her memory would be stained forever. For the AI narrator, emphasize the words "stained forever" with a tone of mock tragedy. To the Victorians, your reputation didn't stop when your heart did. Your diary was your ghostly spokesman. Therefore, even in the deepest solitude, they were never alone. They were always in the presence of their future executors. The lock and key theatre. The physical diary itself was an object of high drama. It usually featured a small, brass lock, the 19th century version of a password, but this lock was often more symbolic than functional. The scandal of the locked book was a favourite parlour topic. By locking the diary, the Victorians signalled that they had secrets. This made them more interesting, more poetic. It was a way of saying, "I am alone, and what I am doing alone is very important." However, many Victorians secretly hoped someone would try to read it. It was a cry for a witness. They spent hours in the solitary chair, writing about how much they valued their seclusion, while simultaneously checking to see if the door was slightly ajar. It was a game of hide and seek, where the self was the prize, and the public eye was the seeker. The accountant of the soul. In the United States, the performative diary took on a more productive energy. Influenced by the Puritan tradition of self-examination, the American diary was less of a poetic drama and more of a spiritual ledger. Young men in Boston or Philadelphia would use their solitary hours to account for their time. They recorded every penny spent and every minute wasted. The red flag for an American was unaccounted time. If they were alone, they had to prove they weren't just idling. They wrote as if God were an auditor. For the American audience, privacy was a quality control session. They weren't performing for the neighbors as much as they were performing for the great ledger in the sky. If they didn't write it down, it was as if they had stolen that time from the Republic. Reading between the lines. Because the diary was so performative, the real secrets had to be hidden in plain sight. Victorians developed a solitary code. If a lady wrote, "spent a quiet hour in the garden with the roses," she might actually mean, "I saw the neighbor's son over the hedge and we shared a meaningful glance for 3 seconds." The roses were code for forbidden interaction. As a result, reading a Victorian diary today is like trying to crack an encrypted file. You have to look for the vibration of the pen. You have to notice what they didn't write. The scandal was often located in the white space between the paragraphs. Their solitude was so crowded with propriety that the only place they could be truly unaccompanied was in the things they left unsaid. The end of the audience. As we moved into the 20th century, the public eye began to fade from our private journals. We started writing for ourselves, or so we thought. Today, we have returned to the Victorian performative privacy with a vengeance. We use social media to document our solitary coffee or our pensive walk in the park. We are once again writing for an audience, but now the audience is millions of strangers instead of 3 concerned aunts. We have turned our secret diaries into public feeds. The Victorians would recognize us immediately. They would see our aesthetic solitude and our curation of the self, and they would say, "Ah, I see you are also terrified of being alone without a witness." We have broken the brass locks of the old diaries, but we have built a much larger, much noisier parlor for the world to watch us drink our tea in silence. The ceremony of the lonely cup. In the modern world, we view a solo cup of tea as a simple comfort, a quick mug brewed in the microwave while standing in our pajamas. But to the Victorian elite, there was no such thing as a quick or casual cup of tea. Tea was a ritual of social standing, and to drink it alone was to walk a tightrope between refined relaxation and total social defeat. If you were a lady or gentleman found with a solitary tea tray, you had to prove that you were not alone because you were unloved, but rather because you were exacting. The tea tray, for one, was a psychological fortress. To prevent it from looking like a sad meal of a social outcast, it had to be arranged with the precision of a military parade. Every piece of porcelain was a witness to your dignity. If the spoon was at the wrong angle, or if the milk was served in a chipped jug, the red flag was raised. It suggested that you had given up on civilization simply because there was no one there to watch you stir. The architecture of the dignified tray. For the voice generator, treat the semicolons as a posh pause and the em-dashes as a revealing beat. The first rule of the solo tea tray was excessive completeness. Even if you were the only person in the house, the tray had to be set for a king. There had to be a teapot, a hot water jug, a slop bowl, a sugar basin, and a silver tea caddy. To use a single cup and a tea bag, had they existed, would have been seen as a symptom of a mental collapse. The porcelain had to be bone china, so thin that you could see the ghost of your own fingers through it. This was the red flag of quality. By using your finest china while alone, you were signaling to the universe, "I respect myself even when the world ignores me." It was an act of self-chaperoning. If you didn't treat yourself like a guest, who else would? The slop bowl and the etiquette of the void. One of the most bizarre items on the solo tray was the slop bowl. Its purpose was to hold the dregs of the first cup before pouring the second. To a modern observer, it is a useless ceramic bucket, but to a Victorian alone in a parlour, the slop bowl was a moral necessity. It proved that you were following the rules of the pour, even when no one was watching. It was a silent witness to your discipline. If a lady was found skipping the slop bowl, it was assumed she was only one step away from hysteria, or worse, becoming an American. For the AI narrator, emphasize the words "becoming an American" with a tone of mock horror. To the British Victorian, the American was someone who drank tea for the taste rather than the theatre, and that was a scandal that no amount of sugar could sweeten. The solo sip and the stare. How did one actually consume the tea while alone? You could not simply gulp. That was the behavior of a laborer. You had to perform the solo sip. This involved holding the saucer in the left hand, yes, even when alone, and lifting the cup with a pinky finger extended just enough to signal refinement, but not so much as to signal arrogance. Where did your eyes go? You could not look at the tea, that was obsessive. You could not look at the door, that was expectant. Instead, you returned to the art of the pensive stare. You looked at the steam rising from the cup as if it contained the secrets of the Great Sphinx. You were not drinking tea, you were communing with the essence of leaves. This turned a moment of potential loneliness into a moment of intellectual superiority. The hustle in the pot. In the United States, the tea tray, for one, was viewed with a healthy dose of skepticism. While the Boston Brahmins tried to maintain the porcelain fortress, the rest of the country was moving too fast for slop bowls. For the American audience, the solo tea tray was often seen as a social defeat because it suggested you weren't networking. In New York or Chicago, if you were alone at tea time, you were losing money. The American red flag was static solitude. However, the wealthy Americans of the Gilded Age compensated by making their solo trays even more expensive. If a Vanderbilt was alone for tea, the tray was solid silver and the napkins were hand-stitched by Belgian orphans. It wasn't about the tea, it was about the inventory of the self. They weren't lonely, they were high-value assets in a state of rest. The audience in the hallway. We must remember that the solo tea tray was never truly solo. There was always the servant who brought the tray, and the servant who took it away. The Victorian unaccompanied person was always under the gaze of the scullery. The servants knew exactly how much sugar you took when you thought no one was looking. They saw the red flag of the bitten biscuit or the spilled drop of milk on the lace cloth. The dignity of the solo tea was a performance for the staff. It was a way of saying, even in my solitude, I am still your master. The cracks in the china. By the end of the century, the elaborate tea ritual began to fade. The tea room was born, allowing people to be alone together in public. The porcelain fortress of the private parlor was breached. Today we drink tea, or more likely, coffee from paper cups while walking down a busy street. We have lost the dignity of the slop bowl, but we have gained the freedom of the unwatched sip. And yet, there is a small part of us that still feels the social defeat of the empty table. We still look for a witness to our caffeine. We take a photo of our latte and post it online, creating a digital tea tray for 1 million virtual guests. We are still trying to maintain our dignity while drinking solo, but instead of bone china, we use filters and hashtags. The Victorian ghost in the parlor would look at our plastic lids and our cardboard sleeves and weep for the loss of our slop bowls, but she would recognize the loneliness behind the performance in a heartbeat. The architecture of intellectual anxiety. In the modern world, we view the library as a temple of self-improvement, a quiet sanctuary where the mind is free to roam, explore, and expand. We tell our children that knowledge is power, but to the Victorian social engineer, knowledge was not just power, it was a volatile explosive. If a person, especially one who was already unaccompanied, spent too much time in a library, they weren't seen as studious. They were seen as a red flag of the highest order. The Victorian library was a place of whispers, not because of the noise level, but because of the terrifying things that happened when a human being was left alone with an original thought. To the 19th century mind, intellectual independence was merely a polite term for social anarchy. They believed that if a man or woman thought too much without the ballast of social conversation, their brain would eventually tip over into the dark waters of radicalism, atheism, or worst of all, nonconformity. The overheated brain, a medical mystery. For the voice generator, treat the semicolons as a scholarly pause and the em-dashes as a revealing beat. Victorian science had a peculiar obsession with mental hygiene. It was believed that the brain was like a steam engine. It required constant venting through social interaction. If you sat alone in a library, reading and thinking without speaking, the internal pressure would build. This led to a condition doctors called the brain fever of the solitary. The symptoms were subtle but dangerous. It started with a preference for heavy books, history, philosophy, or the dreaded scientific theory. Then came the pensive stare that lasted for hours. Finally, the individual would start to question the natural order. They might wonder why the local vicar had so much power, or why women couldn't own property, or why everyone had to wear so much wool in July. To a Victorian, these weren't insights, they were medical emergencies. The library as a panopticon. Because of this fear, the private library was designed to be anything but private. In the great country houses of England and the mansions of the American East Coast, the library was often a thoroughfare. It had multiple doors, and the master of the house was expected to keep them open. A man alone in a library was expected to be cataloguing or writing letters, visible productive acts. If he was found just thinking, his wife or his mother would inevitably enter the room to check the fire or ask his opinion on a new curtain fabric. This was intellectual chaperoning. The goal was to interrupt the thought process before it became too independent. The red flag was the locked library door. A locked door meant that a person was hiding their mind, and in the 1880s, a hidden mind was a dangerous mind. The dangerous woman with a book. If the fear of a thinking man was great, the fear of a thinking woman was a panic. A woman alone in a library was seen as a direct threat to the domestic sphere. There was a genuine medical superstition that excessive study would cause a woman's vital spirits to leave her reproductive system and migrate to her brain, rendering her unfit for the nursery. This created the forbidden subject list. A lady was encouraged to read gentle poetry or travel memoirs, but she was steered away from hard logic. If she was found alone, whispering the words of John Stuart Mill, or heaven forbid Charles Darwin, she was diagnosed with mental overexertion. For the AI narrator, emphasized the words mental overexertion with a tone of dry academic mockery. It was the Victorian way of saying, stop thinking for yourself, it's making you unattractive to the neighbors. The self-taught threat. In the United States, the danger of thinking took on a more political tone. While the British feared a loss of propriety, the Americans feared a loss of practicality. In the American library, the red flag was the ivory tower. A man who spent too much time alone with his books was seen as un-American because he wasn't getting ahead. The American obsession with the self-made man required that you be self-taught, but only to a point. If you became too intellectual, you were no longer a man of the people, you were a heretic of the Republic. For the American audience, the solitary thinker was a suspicious figure. He was someone who might be planning a strike, a commune, or a new religion. Solitude in the library was seen as the breeding ground for utopian schemes, which the practical American viewed as a waste of good timber and honest labor. Reading as a ritual. To mitigate the danger, the Victorians practiced group thinking. This was the antidote to the solitary library. They had reading societies and literary circles. By reading a book together, the thoughts were regulated. If a difficult idea appeared on the page, it was immediately discussed into submission. The whispers in the library were replaced by the chatter of the parlor. This ensured that no one left the room with an original idea that hadn't been filtered through the collective common sense of the group. It was the 19th century version of an algorithm, designed to keep you inside the echo chamber of proper society. The only private voice. The only place where intellectual independence truly survived was in the marginalia, the tiny notes written in the margins of the books. When a Victorian was finally, truly alone in the library, they would scrawl their forbidden thoughts in the edges of the pages. They would write, I disagree, or what if this is wrong? These were the private whispers that survived the era. To find a Victorian book with heavy marginalia is to find a red flag that was hidden for 100 years. It is the record of a human mind trying to escape the quiet prison of Victorian certainty. It is the sound of a person thinking too much and enjoying every scandalous second of it. Conclusion: the silence of the modern study. Today we have conquered the fear of the solitary thinker. We celebrate the deep work and the quiet hour. We have built libraries that are truly silent, and we have made independent thought our highest virtue. But we have also lost the weight of the book. We no longer fear that an idea will overheat our brains, because we are constantly distracted by the whispers of the digital world. We are never truly alone in our libraries anymore, because we carry a billion voices in our pockets. The Victorian ghost in the library would be horrified by our lack of chaperones, but she would also be confused by our lack of originality. She would look at our screens and say, you have all the freedom to think, yet you only use it to agree with one another. Perhaps the danger of thinking too much was a compliment to the power of the human mind, a power that we have traded for the safety of the scroll. The gravity of the goodbye. In the modern era, we have perfected the ghosting technique. If a party becomes dull, or if our social battery drains to zero, we simply slide out the back door, hail a ride via a smartphone, and vanish into the night. We call it an Irish goodbye, and at most it earns us a playful text message the next morning. But in the year 1885, there was no such thing as an invisible exit. To leave a social gathering was a choreographed performance, and to attempt an unescorted exit, to depart a party alone and ahead of schedule, was to trigger a local scandal of seismic proportions. The Victorian party was not a casual hangout, it was a social contract, signed in blood and expensive champagne. Your presence was a vote of confidence in the host's standing. Therefore, your departure was a statement of your own moral character. To leave early was to suggest that the company was insufficient, the host was lacking, or most dangerously, that you had somewhere better to be. In a society where being alone was a red flag, the act of walking out the door by yourself was like lighting a flare in a dark room. The architecture of the proper departure. For the voice generator, treat the semicolons as a theatrical pause and the em-dashes as a revealing beat. The rules for departing were a masterpiece of social engineering. One did not simply leave. First, there was the warning shot, a subtle shifting of the fan or the pocket watch that signaled to the host that the end was near. Then came the circulation, a final lap of the room to ensure that everyone witnessed your dignity one last time. The red flag appeared the moment you reached for your coat without a companion. If you were a gentleman, leaving alone suggested you were heading toward a den of iniquity or a secret gambling hall. If you were a lady, the unescorted exit was practically a confession of social ruin. A lady was expected to wait until her carriage was announced, her chaperone was ready, and her protector was at her elbow. To step into the night air unaccompanied was to surrender your reputation to the wolves of the street. The sudden headache and the medical alibi. Since you couldn't just leave because you were bored, you had to have a valid medical emergency. This gave birth to the Victorian headache, the ultimate social alibi. If you wished to make an unescorted exit, you had to perform a fainting light. You would press a hand to your forehead, let out a ghost breath sigh, and whisper that the gaslight was too stimulating for the nerves. This turned your exit from an act of rudeness into an act of medical necessity. The host would cluck their tongue in sympathy, the guests would whisper about your delicate constitution, and you were allowed to vanish. But even then, the red flag followed you. If you were seen 10 minutes later looking perfectly healthy while walking down the street alone, the headache was revealed as a lie, and you were branded as a deceiver. In the Victorian world, your body had to be as disciplined as your manners. The French leave and the scandal of the empty space. The Victorians had a specific term for leaving without saying goodbye, taking French leave. It was considered the height of cowardice and ill-breeding. To the Victorian mind, an empty space where a person should be was a vacuum that was immediately filled with gossip. If a gentleman vanished from a ball without the formal handshake of departure, the room would conclude that he was fleeing a debt, a duel, or a pregnancy. The unescorted exit was not just about the person leaving, it was about the toxic wake they left behind. For the AI narrator, emphasize the words toxic wake with a tone of dry, historical judgment. To leave without a witness was to leave without a defense. You were essentially allowing the room to rewrite your biography in your absence. The hustle out the door. In the United States, particularly in the fast-paced ballrooms of New York's 400, the exit was less about propriety and more about power. The American unescorted exit was used as a social snub. To leave a party early in New York was a way of saying, I am more important than this room. But even in the Republic, the red flag of the lonely departure remained. An American woman who left a party alone was still seen as vulnerable. This led to the creation of the professional escort, young men of good family but no money who were paid in dinners and social access to ensure that no lady ever had to face the scandal of the empty carriage. In America, privacy was something you bought, and if you couldn't afford a protector, you stayed until the last candle was extinguished. The cloakroom crisis, the final chaperone. The final hurdle of the exit was the cloakroom. This was the purgatory of propriety. Here, the servants acted as the final jury. The way you put on your coat, the way you tipped the footman, and the speed at which you moved toward the door were all documented. If a gentleman was too eager to leave, it was reported. If a lady's hands were shaking as she tied her bonnet, it was whispered. The unescorted exit was a military retreat. You had to move with dignified haste, fast enough to escape the boredom, but slow enough to prove you weren't fleeing. It was a psychological workout that left most Victorians more exhausted by the departure than by the party itself. The freedom of the Uber. By the dawn of the 20th century, the escorted exit began to die out. The automobile changed everything. A car provided a mechanical chaperone, a locked box that could whisk you away from a scandal at 20 miles per hour. Today we have lost the theatre of the goodbye. We leave parties without a word, we cancel via text, and we value our time more than our witnesses. We have won the right to the unescorted exit. But the Victorian ghost at the party would look at our silent departures and wonder, does no one care that you are gone? She would see our ghosting as a sign that we have become invisible to one another. We have escaped the scandal of the empty space, but we have also lost the weight of our presence. To leave a Victorian party was a battle, but at least it meant that for a few hours, you truly mattered to the room. The crumbling of the panopticon. As the 19th century groaned toward its inevitable end, the ironclad walls of Victorian propriety began to show hairline fractures. The scandal of being alone was not defeated by a single revolution or a great war. Rather, it was eroded by the slow, relentless grinding of technology, mobility, and a new, radical idea that the individual was more than just a unit of society. The dawn of the modern individual was not a quiet sunrise. It was a noisy, mechanical, and deeply scandalous affair that turned the red flag of solitude into the white flag of personal freedom. The Victorians had lived in a social panopticon, a world where every pensive stare, every solitary tea tray, and every unescorted walk was a performance for an invisible jury. But by the year 1900, the jury was getting tired, and the performers were starting to walk off the stage. We were entering the era of privacy as we cherish it today, a world where being alone is not a medical emergency, but a human right. The great mechanical liberators. For the voice generator, treat the semicolons, as a grand pause and the M-dashes as a revealing beat. If we were to build a monument to the death of Victorian social control, it would not be made of marble, it would be made of rubber and steel. The first great liberator was the bicycle. As we have seen, it was impossible for an elderly aunt to chaperone a niece who was pedaling away at 15 miles per hour. The bicycle offered velocity-based solitude. It allowed the individual to outrun the gossip of the garden and find a version of nature that wasn't managed by a landlord. Then came the telephone. This was the ultimate parlor game of one killer. The telephone allowed for invisible socialization. You could be alone in your room, properly unaccompanied, while whispering secrets to someone 5 miles away. To the Victorian ghost, this was the height of witchcraft. You were alone, yet you were talking. You were private, yet you were public. The bedroom barrier had finally been breached by a copper wire. The war and the death of the chaperone. The final, brutal blow to the Victorian rules was the Great War. When the world exploded in 1914, the scandal of the solitary chair suddenly seemed remarkably trivial. In a world of trenches and telegrams, no one had the energy to worry about whether a lady was walking 10 yards behind her companion. Women entered the workforce, they moved into bachelor lodgings of their own, and they began to dine alone in restaurants, not as an act of defiance, but as a matter of survival. The chaperone was not fired, she simply became obsolete. There were no more red flags to raise, because the people holding the flags were too busy trying to keep the world from falling apart. The unescorted exit became a permanent way of life. The invention of the teenager and the secret self. By the 1920s, a new creature emerged, the modern youth. In the Victorian era, you were a child until you were a unit of society. But now, there was a middle ground. This was the birth of the secret self. Young people began to value solitude as a space for rebellion rather than refinement. They didn't write letters to no one to prove their morality, they wrote them to vent their frustrations. They didn't use the pensive stare to look poetic, they used it to ignore their parents. Solitude was no longer a medical crisis, it was a lifestyle choice. For the AI narrator, emphasized the words lifestyle choice with a tone of victorious irony. The dangerous lunatic of 1860 had become the cool individual of 1960. The American dream of the studio apartment. In the United States, the dawn of the individual was built on the foundation of the studio apartment. The House of 12 was replaced by the City of Millions. For the American audience, the ultimate victory over Victorianism was the ability to live in a tin can of your own choosing. The boarding house landlady was replaced by the anonymous superintendent. The red flag of being a bachelor without a mother or wife was replaced by the bachelor pad, a place of mystery, freedom, and incredibly questionable interior design. Americans finally achieved the seclusion they had been policed for a century. They could sit in their solitary chairs, eat their TV dinners, the modern version of cold mutton, and stare at the electronic window of the television without a single whisper from the neighbors. A modern irony. However, as we reach the present day, we must ask, did we actually win? We have all the privacy the Victorians feared. We can be alone for days, weeks, or even months. We have perfected the unescorted life. But the scandal has returned in a new form. Today, the red flag is not being alone, it is being offline. If you are alone in a room and you don't post a photo of it, did you really exist? We have replaced the Victorian aunt with the social media algorithm. We are still performing, still documenting, and still looking for a witness to our solitude. We are unaccompanied in the physical world, but we are crowded in the digital one. The Victorian ghost would look at our smartphones and say, I see you have finally found a way to carry the whole town's gossip in your pocket. You are never truly alone, and that is the greatest scandal of all. The legacy of the red flag. The funniest Victorian rules about being alone are funny to us because they seem so distant. We laugh at the slop bowls and the 10-yard rule and the brain overheating. But these rules were based on a fundamental truth that we have forgotten, that being alone is a powerful, transformative, and often terrifying act. The Victorians feared solitude because they knew it was where the individual was born. They knew that a person who can stand their own company is a person who can change the world. They built a quiet prison to keep us safe from ourselves, but we have broken out. As you turn off this narration and return to your modern privacy, take a moment to enjoy your solitary chair. Sit for a moment without a witness. Read a stimulating book without a chaperone. Walk through the street at your own pace. You are living the scandal that an entire century tried to prevent. You are the modern individual, and you have never looked more dangerous or more poetic.